All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. This is our fifth session in the 2021-22 Southeast Indiana Gardening and Natural Resources webinar series. We're really excited to have you on today. Our featured speaker will be Dave Osborne. Dave is the Ag and Natural Resources and 4-H Extension Educator in Ripley County. He is also the County Extension Director in Ripley. We're so happy to have him on. Dave's been a regional pond expert across the state of Indiana for well over a decade now, and so we're so excited to have Dave on the call. We'll let him take over, and feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation.
Okay, so yeah, John, I wish it was only a decade. Try almost 3 decades.
Well, I don't know exactly when you took on that big pond role that you carry, but yeah.
I did ponds even when I was just a youth educator. Today we're going to look at pond management, but we're going to look at it from an ecosystem level. And then at the end, if you've got specific questions, specific weeds, things like that, we'll go over them. I will ask some questions as we go through. Feel free to unmute yourself and chime in and answer those questions. I'd like for this to be as interactive as possible. My favorite way to do these programs is standing beside a pond somewhere where we're all together in person, but we'll dive into this and we'll look at pond management from the ecosystem perspective. So. Okay, John, there it goes. All right. So ponds, more than just a mud puddle. A lot of ponds that were built in Southeast Indiana years ago were built with NRCS funds. They were built as livestock watering holes, and we basically dug a shallow bowl and let it fill with water. And we didn't put a lot of cover on it. We didn't think a lot about pond management, habitat, things like that. So that's what we did. And those ponds are not just a bowl in the ground that hold water. There's a lot of different aspects of a pond to have a healthy pond with good fish growth that's not got too many weeds. It's got adequate habitat and things like that. So we're gonna look at that. What does it take to have a good quality, well-balanced pond ecosystem? In those, there are abiotic factors that we'll look at. Those are the ones that are not living. They're the water, the substrate, the habitat, things like that. And then the biotic side of that thing is all the living organisms, microbes, plants, animals, fish, things like that. So we'll look at each of those today. We're going to look at the food chain, how all these different characteristics interact to create a food chain. And then we're going to maybe talk about some basic management. How can we manage some of these factors? What factors can we manage, and what factors are kind of out of our control to manage? So let's look at the abiotic first. Sunlight. Sunlight is the key to all animal growth, all food webs. It's why we are here on the earth. And sunlight's very important to a pond also. So if a pond is completely shaded, that pond's going to have a different set of dynamics than if a pond's out in the open pasture with no shade at all. So sunlight plays a big factor. Sunlight's what basically provides the energy for the zooplankton, which is the basis of the entire ecosystem in ponds. Next, we'll look at nutrients. Nutrients are those N, P, and K, sulfur, micronutrients like magnesium, things like that, zinc. Those nutrients are very important because they actually feed the system. They're what those phytoplankton use to combine with photosynthesis and for cell growth, to develop the food system, to lock up the energy, things like that. So if you're ever looking at a pond management program and it talks about fertilization, That is not for the Midwest. Our ponds here are very rich in nutrients. So nutrients are generally not a problem with ponds in the Midwest. If we're looking at, do we have enough? Most of our issues are we have way too many nutrients. Then we'll look at dissolved oxygen. That's what allows organisms, especially plant and animal organisms, to survive in a pond situation. They have to have adequate oxygen. Temperature plays a role in the amount of dissolved oxygen and the amount of plants and their uptake of nutrients. We'll talk about turbidity, which is kind of how clear the water is, how much sunlight penetrates, how deep the sunlight penetrates, and then we'll look at pH. Ponds also have important non-living processes. Sedimentation is something that happens in almost all ponds, especially if you've got any surface runoff water, or if you're in a wooded situation where you have a lot of leaf litter that goes in, we get sedimentation in ponds. Ponds through the year stratify. That stratification can lead to what people call turnover. And that turnover, generally when people say turnover, they're talking about deoxygenization of a pond, and it leads to fish kills. But a pond actually naturally turns over every spring and every fall. And we'll look at that. I've got some pictures. We'll walk through what that process looks like. So let's look at sunlight. Sunlight drives photosynthesis of plants. So here's the first question, first chance to unmute. What are the products of photosynthesis that are important for all life on Earth? Give me a couple products of photosynthesis.
Oxygen.
Oxygen, that's a big one. We could not breathe on this earth if we did not have green plants photosynthesizing and creating oxygen. What's another one? You will not be graded on your answers.
Dave, some people are putting in chat. One of them says chlorophyll, another says glucose.
Okay, glucose. That's actually most of the time not in the form of glucose, but glucose is an answer. It's sugars. Most of our plants actually produce cellulose, fructose, sucrose, a lot of those sugars, those long chain carbons. So photosynthesis basically takes that carbon dioxide molecule. It uses the energy of the sun to split off oxygen. That gives us the oxygen, and it stacks carbon chains in the form of sugars. That's where all living organisms get their energy from the sun, is those long chain sugars. And I've done this a lot of years, and a lot of people always get oxygen, but a lot of times they don't understand the sugar side. So that's what drives in ponds, just like it does for the pastures and the cattle and the sheep and goats and all that. Ponds the same way. That phytoplankton is the basis that drives the energy uptake of the sun and produces oxygen. Sunlight helps warm the water. It warms a lot more in the summer. And that sunlight penetration we'll look at here a little bit later varies with the water color. So we've got all different things that can color water, and we'll talk about some of those here in a minute. Nutrients, Midwest ponds are naturally high in nutrients. Nutrients come in from runoff, from leaching, from plants that blow in like leaves, or plants that grow in the water and die and recycle the nutrients. So those nutrients, that's how they get into the pond situation. High nutrients in a pond can drive algal blooms and excessive plant growth. And a lot of times I get calls going, how do I treat that? Was there a question out there? Okay. Nutrients also help a pond be productive and grow fish. Those nutrients that we have in that system, that energy that's bound by those green plants that then feed insects and small fish and zooplankton, which is the animal-sized plankton, all that is really required to be productive and grow fish. And Our ponds in the Midwest, especially in southern Indiana, are very fertile ponds and grow extremely healthy fish. We can grow bluegill to a pound in our ponds in most of Indiana in 3 years. So I always get the thing, and if I watch the fishing sites on Facebook and stuff, people are always screaming at people keeping too many fish. Well, 99% of the ponds that I visit are underfished, never overfished. People think, well, if I take these bluegill out, I won't have any more, and that's not the case. They will replace themselves on an annual basis. So, and then again, we talk too many nutrients result in excessive plants, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we get a little further in the program. The last really abiotic factor that really constitutes kind of the top three is dissolved oxygen. That oxygen has to be in that pond for all living organisms, plant and animal. Most dissolved oxygen in a pond, though, and people don't really realize that, about 90 to 95% of that dissolved oxygen comes from plants and photosynthesis, not the atmosphere. There is some dissolved oxygen added from the surface exchange. You know, the actual contact with the atmosphere, but most of the oxygen in that pond ecosystem is from plants and photosynthesis. Aeration added to a pond can help the dissolved oxygen. What that aeration does is it physically lifts that water and stirs that water to the surface, and that's how it becomes oxygenated. The little bubbles that are coming through the water really don't do much oxygenation of the water. They simply lift the water to the surface. And then dissolved oxygen is linked to temperature. The cooler the water, the higher the oxygen holding capability is in that water. So let's look at a basic pond with this little diagram here. During the day, when the sun's out, the solar energy hits the water, the phytoplankton and green plants absorb that energy. They give off O2, they take in CO2, and they store the energy in sugars available for other organisms, insects, fish, animals, things like that. What a lot of people don't realize, and I taught this at my last pond clinic, and about half of the people there had no idea, though, that when the sun goes down at night, all those green plants that were photosynthesizing and creating oxygen during the day actually start to respirate. And that's what we do. When we breathe in and breathe out, we breathe in, take out the O2 from what we in and expel CO2. Well, plants do the same thing. They take in oxygen at night and give off CO2. We're lucky that most of the summer days are long enough that in the summer and warm water conditions, we have a net O2 production because those plants actually respirate and take in O2 at a lower level than they actually give off O2 through the day. But all the organisms in the dark, all the plants, all the zooplankton, the phytoplankton, the animals, the plants, and everything in that pond are taking in oxygen and giving off CO2. That's why the most stressful time in a pond situation is always that last hour to 2 hours before daylight, because everything in that pond's been respiring the entire night. I just wanted you to see this difference between daytime and nighttime. And then if we look in the winter, we'll see the winter. We'll even talk a little bit more about the length of each of those. In the summer, we've got a lot more daytime light hours than we do nighttime. And in the winter, that's the opposite. So any questions so far? Okay, let's look at temperature. Temperature is very much what Mitch Zinsky, who put this presentation together, calls as the master variable. If we've got medium temperatures, we've got temperatures between 50 and 70 degrees. These aquatic ecosystems are just happy, happy, happy. Plenty of dissolved oxygen, plenty of plant growth, plenty of things going right. It's when we get ice on for a long period of time without sunlight penetration, or we get water temperatures up in that 80, 90 degree mark, is where dissolved oxygen and things like that start to become an issue. So the temperature is key. And that's why a lot of times when people call me at the 4th of July, I typically do not recommend people applying chemicals to ponds between the 4th of July and Labor Day, because I never know when we're going to get a week of 100 degrees every day and 80 degrees at night, and those ponds just get incredibly warm. And that creates a real stress for dissolved oxygen. It also, temperature makes metabolism rise, plant growth rises, fish activity rises to a point, and then declines as it gets warmer and warmer. But all that increased activity also create a lot higher metabolism, a lot more taking in oxygen, giving off CO2. And typically in the Midwest, your shallow ponds typically be a lot warmer pond than a deep pond. Turbidity, the other factor, that is from suspended sediments that run off that had mud in it or soil suspended in it. They can be tannins if you've got a pond that gets leaves in it, especially leaves like oak leaves, red oak leaves. They're full of tannins, and they'll actually stain the water to look kind of like a light tea or a diluted tea look. And planktonous algae or phytoplankton blooms can actually turn that water into kind of a turquoise color. So those things can cause turbidity. Turbidity is basically a coloration of the water that restricts the sunlight penetration. It's often linked to the land use. Like I said, is it in the woods? Is there runoff from ag fields? You know, what's going on? So land use practices a lot of times play a big role in turbidity. It can prevent sunlight penetration and plant growth if it gets turbid enough. And a turbid pond or a pond that's muddy or tannic looking always heat faster and retain their heat longer than ponds that are clear water ponds. The last thing we'll look at is pH. Luckily in the Midwest, especially in southern Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, most of our substrate is limestone. So that limestone gives us a very huge buffering agent for pH. And so pH is typically, I've not gone to a single pond in 28 years of doing this where pH was a problem. There have been some ponds I know in Western Indiana that were kind of the coal mine, strip mine reclamation area that might have some acidity problems. But in general, pH is not much of a problem. You can test the pH in your pond if you want to, and you can simply use a test strip from a local pool supply. And most of our ponds should be between 5 and 10. 5 to 10 pH is very suitable for plant growth and fish development. Sedimentation is runoff. Sedimentation not only causes turbidity, or the soil in there causes turbidity, but that sedimentation will start to fill in a pond. And you'll start to lose pond depth and things like that. Now, that sediment typically is full of nutrients, or if it comes through certain areas, like from a town where you've got cars parked along there and the storm sewer comes off and you've got oil leaks or fuel leaks, you can have pollutants come in through that runoff, and they can be attached to the particles of soil and the sediment particles. This can a lot of times be prevented if you can put in like a catch basin, grass waterway that leads to your pond, maybe a buffer strip with vegetation, things like that, to help reduce the sediment that's actually reaching your pond. Stratification and turnover. If you've ever had a summer fish kill, that fish kill happened because your pond stratified. And it didn't really turn over. We'll talk about that term a little bit. It didn't really turn over. What it actually did is it mixed. And I've got a couple examples, and we'll walk through those examples here, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So this is a summer example. On your left-hand side, every summer, once the ice comes off, that pond, in the absence of aeration, starts to stratify. There's an area down low in the water column that the light doesn't reach. So there's no phytoplankton. The green plants down in that area do not get enough sunlight to produce oxygen. They're actually probably respirating, which means they're giving off CO2 and taking in oxygen. So you start to get an area in that pond that the dissolved oxygen is too low for plant life and fish life. As the summer moves on, so we go to the second picture, you see that area comes up from the bottom. That non-oxygenated zone comes up from the bottom. And the longer we go into the summer, the hotter that water gets, the higher that bottom zone, or the thicker that bottom zone can be. In a 10-foot pond, there's a chance sometimes that bottom zone can be 6 foot, 7 foot off the bottom. So you only have 2 to 3 foot of oxygenated water that will support fish life. It has enough oxygen. So what happens is we get a storm with high winds, lots of runoff. That cold water, when it runs across the ground, if you've ever been out in a thunderstorm, you feel the temperature of that water that came out of those clouds. It's cold. A lot of times it's 20 to 25 degrees colder. It runs into the pond in big volume, and it heads straight to the bottom. And that, going from the surface to the bottom of that cold water, actually stirs the pond up. And you can see in the third picture, that stirring creates the fact that pond no longer has enough oxygen, because it stirred that oxygenated layer with the non-oxygenated layer. And the result is the whole pond doesn't have enough oxygen to sustain fish, and you get fish die off. A lot of times it's not a total fish kill. It can be a partial fish kill, but that's what happens. And people always call that turnover, but the pond didn't really turn over. It really just stirred. You see in the last picture, no plant. You can actually see as the pictures move along, the green plants become less and less in that deoxygenated zone. So everything in that is anaerobic. All the decomposition of all the plant material, all that is all giving off CO2 and using oxygen. So it just feeds on itself. If we wanted to talk a little bit about aeration, what we would do is we put aeration in early so that first picture never sets up. That aerator is actually stirring the pond the entire summer, and the whole pond stays oxygenated. So you never get the stratification setting up. So that's a summer fish kill, or what can lead to what they call a summer turnover, but you see it's not really a turnover. Here's the winter version. So what happens in the winter is we get ice covering that covers that pond. When that happens, it's kind of like putting cellophane on top of a bowl. It seals that pond. So now that what's in that pond is in that pond. It cannot do any gas exchange with the atmosphere. And so it has what it has. And as long as that ice is thin and light can penetrate through that ice, we get that zooplankton or phytoplankton, that green planktonous algae, still producing oxygen. And the fish are happy. The green plants can still produce oxygen. But remember, we talked about length of daylight and length of night. The nights are longer and longer. So there's a lot more time that those green plants are using oxygen and giving off CO2 than they're producing oxygen. So you get in the second picture, you've got snow cover, less light penetration, and you see that blue zone. That blue zone is deoxygenated. And so it's not as severe, and we don't get as severe a mixing, but you get a zone in there that has oxygen, but the overall pond is starting to lose its oxygen. The dissolved oxygen level is going down in the whole pond. And as we move into the winter, the longer that ice and snow stays on that pond, the shorter the days get, the less green plants survive. They die, so they start to decompose. You see less and less oxygen, to the point that if we get weeks and weeks of that, all of a sudden you get a winter fish kill, and you may never see that because those fish fall to the bottom. They start to decompose. They don't ever float to the top. All you notice is you get out in the spring and you're just not seeing the fish like you did. And that can be a winter kill. And a winter kill is kind of a silent kill most of the time. Any questions about summer kill and winter kill? Again, if we put aeration in this winter situation, we actually keep the ice from sealing over. It's tough if you love the ice fish like I do, because you're not going to have ice around where the aerator is, but it never lets this deoxygenation start to happen. It keeps things oxygenated. So if you're going to build a pond and you want a great fishery, the best insurance in the world is aeration. So let's look at some of the biotic characteristics. Let's look at the microbes. They're the bacteria that are in a pond. They're responsible for a lot of the systems in a pond, the plant material that degrade, the cycling of the nutrients, things like that. Then we have the primary producers that take that sunlight, produce oxygen, produce sugars, feed the food web. That's the algae, mainly filamentous algae, things like that can be part of that, but mainly that's the planktonous algae and the green plants. Then we have the consumers and several layers of consumers. We have primary, secondary, 4 or 5 levels of consumers. Those are all insects, fish, birds, mammals, zooplankton, which is the equivalent kind of to phytoplankton. They're single-celled or small-celled organisms. But if any of you have ever, when you were younger, bought the little package of stuff to put in the fish bowl to grow sea monkeys, those are Daphnia, those are zooplankton. So those type of organisms are huge for the food chain to feed the small minnows, the insect larvae, all that. They feed on the small planktonous algae that convert that sugar to a form that animals can use. We're not able to use cellulose in the human body. Luckily, we have other animals that can convert that cellulose to sugar, or we have fruits or plants like sugarcane that can convert that to glucose, sucrose, and things we can actually use. And then the last part of the biotic is the detritivores or decomposers. Those are the organisms that recycle the dead plant material, the dead animal material, and are responsible for helping to cycle those nutrients. The other interactions that are biotic are interactions such as predation. That's when organisms feed on other organisms. Larger fish feed on smaller fish. We have competition. A lot of times competition can be within a species or between species. Like bass and crappie are competitors for the same food source in most of our pond situations. And then we have an interaction with habitat. Like I said, most of our ponds were built with very poor habitat. It'd be like pouring a slab of concrete and put a fence around it and throw a couple cottontail rabbits out there and say, hey, have at it and live a good life. Well, a cottontail rabbit would not have any place to hide. They wouldn't last very long. So habitat's very important to ponds, just like it is to wildlife, woods, thickets, things like that. And we'll talk a little bit more about habitat here in a minute. Okay, pond microbes. They are viruses, bacteria, fungi, lots of different microbes. If you look at the fish on the right, that's typically called ick. If you've ever gone to a pond and had a kind of an itch when you were done and called swimmer's itch, it's the same bacteria, the same fungal diseases. Most of the time fish, if they get these, they get them in warm water conditions and they'll be fine. They'll actually work their way out of it as long as they're not overpopulated. You see a lot more ick and things like that where people feed the fish, so the fish are tight in competition and they're rubbing up against each other, or they're damaging themselves or their scales or their slime coat by competition to feed. Many of these microbes are important for breaking down organic matter, cycling the nutrients, doing things like that. There are some that can cause diseases and parasites, and sometimes there are some treatments that we can do for those parasites, but most of the time, the Mother Nature kind of has to fix that. And then there's some other like blue-green algae that are actually cyanobacteria. We've seen a lot more prevalence of that in the last couple of years. If you're interested in more information on blue-green algae, a PhD biologist at Aquatic Control and I put together a publication about 2 years ago that's on the pond management website at Purdue that really kind of spell out the whole blue-green algae situation, when you should be concerned, when maybe you should protect the kids, the grandkids, the pets from feeding or swimming in the pond, things like that. But we're lucky that most of the time blue-green algae is not a huge problem in southern Indiana. So primary producers, they're the ones that obtain the energy from the sun. They store the sugars to be used by the next group in the food chain. They provide 80 to 90% of the dissolved oxygen in ponds. So that green color that's out there in the pond naturally is that phytoplankton, is that primary producer, is the key to the health of that overall water situation. The phytoplankton, even though sometimes it gets pretty thick and can kind of leave a scum, or some people will call me and say, hey, I've got an oily film on my pond. When that planktonous algae blooms and just explodes with a lot of nutrient input to a pond that's got warm water conditions, people are concerned what can you do about that. And most of the time there's no treatment that we can do. It's just, if you put nutrients in a pond that's 85 to 90 degrees in temperature like we have the last couple of Julys and August, you're going to get some of these excessive growth of these organisms, especially some of the algae that we have out there. Primary producers, especially green plants like cattails and moss and moss. Some people call moss the filamentous algae. Others will like naiad and pondweed and things like that. These are all habitat. They produce substrate and structure for insect larvae, for lots of different organisms to grow. And as you increase habitat, you increase growth potential of fish and the health of the overall pond. They can be problematic when there are excessive nutrients. And that's when I get a call and their pond's completely covered with filamentous algae. And we can talk about that toward the end if someone has a question about how to do that. So primary producers are what take that energy from the sun and give it to everything else in that pond ecosystem. The consumers, you see on the top left, that's that sea monkey. That's that zooplankton. Some people will call them freshwater shrimp, brine shrimp, lots of different names for them. Daphnia is the name, and there's hundreds of kinds of Daphnia. They eat that phytoplankton, and then they become food for things like tadpoles and fish and insects and insect larvae. A lot of our aquatic insect larvae are feeding on these zooplankton. The secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. Energy from the sun flows through the food web. And then if you see the crawfish, things like that, and some of the different insects that are on the bottom, some of the fungi, they are your detritivores or decomposers, and they help recycle the dead organisms. So here's just a quick picture of 4 levels of consumers, kind of how things link together. Again, this presentation will be available. You can download it and look at it. But if you look at the primary producers, we're looking at aquatic plants and phytoplankton. Then we go to our first consumers, grass carp, zooplankton, insect larvae. You see how each thing in the next level tends to feed on that zooplankton. Small bluegill feed on it, aquatic insects feed on it, minnows feed on it. Then you get the bigger fish feeding on the smaller fish. Then you get us as consumers, great blue herons, mink, otters. things like that that come in that become the primary consumer. And then you see as these things die and cycle through, you got decomposers, which a lot of times are bacteria and fungi, and detritivores, insect larvae, clams, mussels, crayfish, lots of those things that help recycle this dead and dying product into nutrients and put them back into the system. Any questions about that? We okay, Tom? Anybody typed in a question?
Yep, nothing lately, Dave.
Okay,
Doing good.
so let's look at fish and fish numbers a little bit. We're going to look at one of the biggest factors is predation. Predation is one of the most important processes in a pond. I had a true call. I don't have to make these up. Last week I had a call and a guy had a pond that was 1/3 of an acre, and he just wanted to put bluegill in there so he could grow really big bluegill. Anybody want to unmute and tell me if that's a good idea or a bad idea? Didn't want bass, didn't want anything but bluegill.
I'll guess it's a bad idea because what are they going to eat?
Oh, the bluegill will eat fine. They'll have plenty of food. They're early down in that food web. The problem is they're going to reproduce and reproduce and reproduce, and nothing's going to eat them. He said, "Oh, I'll catch them enough that I'll keep the numbers down." Well, there's not very many fishing methods to catch 1-inch and 2-inch bluegill. I've seen little ponds that have nothing but bluegill, and the biggest bluegill is 2 inches, 2.5 inches, and almost impossible to catch with a fishing pole. So a single species environment like that, not a great idea just to put bluegill. Now, I told him if he wanted to sort bluegill and only put male bluegill in there, and he wanted to put 100 of them in there, they would grow very well, and he could replace them as he put in there. But I said, one female bluegill is going to throw that all out, because if you sort them wrong and get one female in there, she's going to reproduce and then Katie bar the door. So predation is extremely important. It drives the numbers for prey and predators. When I get calls and people say, "What do I stock my pond with?" They're always wanting to stock their pond to get bigger fish. But 99 times I go out and look at the fish, I catch some fish. Their fish are all stunted because they have too many fish, and they're going to try to throw fish at a numbers problem. So most of the time when we're not getting the fish growth and the potential growth out of a pond that we want, we simply have too many fish. And I'll share with you that if you have a pond, say a 1-acre pond, somebody throw a number out there. If you have a 1-acre pond and it's been growing bluegill for 2 or 3 years, and the biggest bluegill are 7 or 8 inches, how many of those 7, 8-inch bluegill should you keep a year in that 1-acre pond? Any numbers coming in, Tom?
No, nobody's saying it in chat.
Well, I'll give you the number. If you've got 3 size classes in that pond, which means you've got a pretty good managed population, you should keep 500 bluegill per acre per year. There are very few pond owners that I know that keep that many fish a year, unless they have Dave come and fish in their pond, and then I help them out all I can. But if that pond's 3 years old and every fish in there is 5 inches, you may have to keep 2,000, because you may not have enough bass in there that are big enough to actually maintain the numbers. Because that pond, that 1-acre pond, only has so much growth. And let's just call that growth 100. If that 1-acre pond has 100 units of growth, and for bluegill, and you have 100 bluegill in there, each of those bluegill get 1 unit of growth. And say that's 3 inches of growth. But if you have 300, they all get 1/3 of that. So those 300 bluegill only have the potential to grow 1 inch. If you have 3,000 bluegill in there, those bluegill for that 100 growth units will grow 1/10 of an inch a year. That's where all these fish sizes start to stack up and you get what we call stunted fisheries. And the stunted fishery doesn't mean the biology is bad in those fish or the genetics is bad. It simply means it's a numbers game. So pond owners need to use predation to manage fish populations. You need to have a predator like bass in there. The bass need to be able to get big enough to, to eat fairly good sized bluegill. And a good rule of thumb is if you have an acre or bigger pond and you don't have a bunch of people fishing every day, never throw a bluegill back. Use it as fertilizer in the garden, feed the possums and the skunks, or clean them and eat them yourself. But you've got to manage those numbers to have a good fishery, a good growing fishery. Competition. Organisms compete with each other for food, space, and other resources. Interest specific is the same species. So bluegill are going to compete for the same types of food source. If you put red ear in that pond, red ear is very much like a bluegill. If you put crappie in that pond or lake, small crappie eat the same things that bluegill and red ear do. So if you continually put the same types of fish in there or similar species, they may compete evenly with the same food sources. But if you put channel cat, bluegill, and bass, those three species have different types of food source. For the bass, the little bluegill are their food source. For the channel cat's a little bluegill or any weak bass or bluegill in there, the channel cat will catch and eat. And the channel cat babies, if you have nesting structure for them, become food for the bass. And there you got your food web. So you want to make sure you have several species. Competition is good, but you don't want so much competition that you start losing your growth potential. Then you see at the bottom, invasive species can impact this competition. In a pond situation, invasive species can be green sunfish. And green sunfish are basically a cross between a red ear, a bluegill, a rock bass, a bluegill, lots of different crosses that are out there. And the reason that a green sunfish is bad for a pond is a green sunfish that's a third the size of a bluegill, an eating size bluegill can eat the same food sources and be that small, and they reproduce so spectacularly compared to regular bluegill that you got all these little fish running around with really big mouths and they just eat everything and they just don't have a food source that will sustain them or help them to grow. So green sunfish in a pond can really almost knock all the growth potential of bluegill right in the head. So those are the kind of invasives. Some of the invasives that we have around would be green sunfish, any of the carp species, koi, common carp, or species like bullheads, yellow bellies, brown bullheads, things like that. You want to be very careful of not letting those types of species get in a pond, or they will take over that pond system because they're just more competitive. That invasive species, the reason they're called invasive is they just outcompete the natural things or the things we want in a pond situation. Okay, pond habitat. It consists of both abiotic and biotic factors. Most of our ponds are very lacking in habitat. They were not built with habitat in mind. You know, some of the pond habitat, temperature and dissolved oxygen, things like that are some things that are important for that pond to be healthy. But the other abiotic factors is rocks, sand, gravel, wood, artificial habitat, hiding habitat. Aquatic vegetation like biotic factors is important. It is important, but I will caution you, don't go out and plant a bunch of aquatic vegetation. If you buy a plant at a hardware store made for water gardens, those are invasive species. They will take over your pond. Let Mother Nature kind of take care of this vegetation and then just manage that vegetation to keep it You know, a few cattails in a pond are great. Cattails 6 foot deep all the way around the pond where you can't get to the pond, not so great. So manage those factors, but manage that cover. Look in the bottom left-hand corner of the picture here. That's a picture of a bluegill bed. If you notice in that bluegill bed, you look out a little bit deeper, you'll see a couple bigger rings. Those are bass beds. The bass will tend to come into this area. They'll nest first. The bluegill will come in and they're colony nesters. Gonna look like that honeycomb area there. In a 1 acre lake, if you go around your lake in early June, late May, and in a 1 acre lake, if you do not see 5 or 6 of the areas that look like that picture, and maybe you only find one of those, one of the biggest limiting factors in your pond is reproduction or spawning habitat. Most of the ponds I go out and look at that have problems with numbers and their fish just aren't reproducing, they simply don't have enough spawning habitat. And spawning habitat is easy. We go out there when the ice is on with a wheelbarrow pea gravel, about 2 foot off the bank, about 5 foot wide and about 6 inches deep on the ice. And then as the ice melts, it just falls into place. That pea gravel nesting area will be utilized very well by bass and bluegill that same spring. And so putting in spawning habitat. So if you've got a pond that's just not doing what you think it should do, go around with some sunglasses on early in June, late May, and count your bluegill beds. Make sure you have bluegill beds. If you see bluegill beds that are just one here and one there, they're around the whole pond, but there's not any groups, that's not very efficient bluegill nesting, because bluegill are colonial nesters and they all kind of help fend off the small bluegill from coming in, and they kind of protect each other's nests. So the internal nests become a lot more productive than the outside nests because they got the outside bluegill running off the small bluegill, the minnows, things like that, the small bass. So they need to nest in groups. In some ponds, they can only nest in like two foot of bank is the only substrate where they can fan that nest and get down to hard subsurface to lay their eggs so that their eggs don't suffocate. If you see a spotty thing like that, put in some of that nesting structure so they can become colonial nesters and they'll do much better.
Dave, are those actually tires in that lower left picture?
Nope, that's what those fish will actually make. They'll dish out that nest, and that's the silt layer on the bottom forms that little lip, and they'll go down to the hard surface in the bottom. And that hard surface can be clay, it could be sand, it could be gravel. Pea gravel and sand are the best things, because what happens is those eggs lay on that layer and they don't silt in, and they actually get to hatch. Any silt that gets on an egg, it suffocates the eggs and they're not productive. So no, those are not tires. That's
Okay.
just what that nest area will look like.
All right, thanks.
Any other questions? Got a couple more slides and then we'll open it up for question and answer. More Than Just a Puddle is a publication. It's actually in the pond management section. So if you go into Forestry and Natural Resources, Purdue University Pond Management, you're going to see about 4 or 5 new publications. This publication's there. The aquatic weed management publications there. There's a couple fish management publications there about how to determine if your fish are actively growing and growing well. There's some forms there you can fill out. There's some different methods you can use. The blue-green algae publications there. So that website's a real good website to look at for new resources. We have an IBAT team that in the last 3 or 4 years has put up at least 5 brand new resources for the pond owners to utilize. Any questions?
Any questions for Dave? I'll go back to something, Dave, while I let our participants think, because I had one. Some of my clients here in Dearborn County have asked me, those icing over events with our ponds in this area, you can go a season without really seeing much ice on your pond. But in those scenarios where we do stay pretty darn cold for a while and you do see that significant sheet develop, I've had clients ask me, and I forget where the conversation went, but they said, do I go in and break that ice up to kind of address the issues you mentioned? What's your thought on that?
If we get, I usually say if we have ice with snow cover where we're not getting any light penetration for more than a couple of weeks. In other words, we're pushing that third week, that fourth week. It may make sense to slip out there if the ice is safe enough for you to do that, or use a boat, pull a boat out with a rope or something, and shovel some of that snow off so that the light can penetrate through the ice, and take an auger or something and pop some holes in there. The holes may not stay open very long, but they do break that gas barrier. They do allow some gas to escape. They do allow some transfer, but getting that snow off that ice, shoveling a 10 by 10 square, a couple places, if you can let that sun penetrate that water column to kind of kickstart that phytoplankton, you can help reoxygenate that pond. If you're ice fishing in a pond and you're catching good fish, and then all of a sudden you go back one day and you don't even get a bite, that's a very good indicator that pond just became stressed from a dissolved oxygen standpoint. Those fish, they'll quit moving. They won't open their mouth. They'll just lay on the bottom. So if you've got a pond that you normally do very well in, and all of a sudden the fish just aren't biting, if you see little white wigglers come up in your hole, it'll just be like a white nymph. Those insect larvae are telling you that the dissolved oxygen is so low that they're coming off the bottom up to the surface of the ice, and that's a good indicator. So there's a couple indicators we can use, but I'm one of those that, especially the shallower the pond is, 7, 6, 8 feet, those are the ponds that are real sensitive. If you got a pond that's 16 foot deep, 18 foot deep, you probably got enough water volume there that you're not going to have much of a problem. That's why we want ponds to be deep. But in those shallower, right on the edge ponds, 6 to 8 foot, sometimes shoveling or popping holes will help that pond. It may not keep you from a winter kill, but it's better to try it than not to.
I'm going to say, Dave, if you wanted to stop sharing your screen, then we'll maybe go back to a larger layout. But we're going to say glad to see Steve Forster on here. I know, Steve, you were having some issues, I believe. So glad that you finally were able to do that. And so maybe for a few of those that came on later, John had mentioned in the beginning that this session is recorded like all the others. And hopefully that'll be up on the Dearborn County YouTube channel later today or soon. It will be there. Again, you're welcome to unmute your mic if you want and ask a question or put it down there in the chat.
I just put my cell number in there. If you've got questions or things you want to talk about, I will talk pond management anytime, 7 days a week. If you call me at 3 in the morning, you might get a real sleepy Dave, but there's my number. If you want to put that in your cell phone, if you got questions coming up, if you're close in Southeast Indiana, I will try to work away. If you need me to come out and look at a pond, I love to come out and look at it. So.
I know, Dave, you sort of touched on the aquatic weed management and that type of thing, and when to try to control some of that or not, or again, to know a little bit of that's okay, but if you get too much and excessive, it's not.
Yeah, early, cold water. As soon as those plants start to green up, it's not any different than trying to spray 6 foot tall plants in your garden or your yard. Doesn't work. Get on those pond weeds early. As soon as the water temperature hits 55, 60 degrees, we've got plenty of dissolved oxygen. Those plants die. They haven't had 2 months to add volume. And so you're killing fewer plants, less volume, less chance of becoming a problem. So get on pond weeds early. And most of the chemicals we use only have about a 2 to 3 week window. If you see it green back up 3 weeks later, hit it again. I like the products like Reward and Diquat, and the new Clipper and Propeller are two of those newer products that actually have algal control. They have weed control with contact, and they also have systemic control. So we've been waiting for that kind of one product in a bottle for everything. Propeller is that product. Clipper is that product. So if you haven't tried that product and you want a kind of one-stop shop for algae, rooted weeds, submerged weeds, and things like that, try Clipper or Propeller. I think you'll be happy with it.
Yeah, and the only last comment I was going to say, sometimes when I go out and look at some ponds or take phone calls myself and they're frustrated, I said, well, what do you want to have? Do you want to have a swimming pool, to look at in that pond? Or do you want, for recreation kind of thing?
Yeah, I start my person to person. If you want a swimming pool, build a swimming pool, you'll be happy. If you want a swimming pool out of a pond and you want fish, you're not going to be happy with either one. So I agree with you. Again, it's getting on things early. It's managing. Weeds in a pond are not bad. It's just out of control weeds or weeds around your swimming area or your dock or things like that. So we can manage weeds without having to try to clean out the entire pond. So, and knowing what weed you're dealing with, you'll see some of the labels on these products have different rates for different weeds because some weeds are just tougher than others.
Right.
The other thing, if you're going to treat weeds in the mid-morning, don't come home and treat them right before dark, because when those weeds go to respirating all night long, the chemical doesn't go in them, the chemical doesn't affect them, and you have a very short window to affect those weeds. Just like if you're spraying your yard for chickweed and things like that, have them actively growing. Don't spray them on the coldest day when everything kind of shut down and went dormant. Spray them when they're actively growing. Give them some hours of daylight for that product to get in that plant, and you'll have a lot better control. That last half hour before dark, when I got home and I had time to do it, not a good time to spend money putting chemical in a pond.
Yeah, good comments, Dave. And I guess along with that, I'd say kind of watch the weather, because you don't want a big rain event coming right after you treated it.
Yeah,
too.
if you're using Diquat, a systemic herbicide, and you put it in there and 2 inches of rain come a half hour later and go over the overflow, you might as well treat again, because you just diluted and lost all your chemical.
All right, well, we're getting close to that 1 o'clock hour, but if anyone has another question, you can unmute and ask or put it in the chat. And I'll say maybe John was going to conclude with this, but our next session in this series will be on February the 10th, and it's on the home lawn care. Or I'm sorry, the 27th, January the 27th is on winter landscape management. That's actually the next one. Then there'll be February 10th is home lawn care, and then on February 24th is a gardening 101.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Appreciate you doing that. I will not be on the next one, so please, everyone, tune in. We'll have some really great speakers. Like I said, this will be recorded. I'm going to stop the recording now, and it will be posted on our YouTube page. Thanks for joining us.